Hello and welcome to another episode of Season 2 of Gupshup with Gayatri, Old World Conversations with New Age Technology. As many of you know, Gupshup is a series of light and casual conversations on topical issues with domain experts and women of substance. But light does not mean it's frivolous. Casual does not make it flippant. Gupshup is not gossip. Gupshup is in fact an intimate chat in the company of family and friends in the age of social distancing and lockdowns. Admin, I would request you to highlight videos of Prachi and me. Thank you. As I was saying, Gupshup is not designed as a high voltage toxic debate aimed at getting you angry and agitated. Rather, it's an endeavor to ignite a meaningful conversation so that one has the time and leisure to ponder, reflect, learn, and sometimes even unlearn about issues that concern us all. Does that mean that no uncomfortable questions will be asked? They will, but not in the nation wants to know, Bharat puchta hai kind of way. Gupshup is broad in its scope. Previous episodes have dealt with topics ranging from Hindustani classical music, LGBTQ rights, arts education, food, films, fashion, to name just a few. But what makes Gupshup truly unique is the interactive nature of the interview and the quality of the audience. The predominantly female audience of Gupshup is well-educated, intelligent, and discerning. They are the opinion makers and the decision makers of today's India, and naturally have lots to say. So, dear audience, thank you for tuning in today. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy Gupshup with Gayatri, Old World Conversations with New Age Technology. Let me now turn to our guest for the evening. Our guest today is very, very, very special. Her academic credentials are impeccable, her resume stellar, and her work impactful. Dr. Prachi Mishra currently works at the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C. as an advisor as part of his leadership team in the fund's research group. She is the co-editor of the IMF Economic Review. She stepped down recently as the chief India economist of the leading investment bank, Goldman Sachs, and was posted in Mumbai. She has had senior stints at the Reserve Bank of India, Finance Ministry, Govt of India, and the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Prachi, it's my absolute privilege and pleasure to invite you on the occasion of Friendship Day to Gupshup with Gayatri. Welcome.
Thank you, Gayatri, for organizing, and the pleasure is all mine. It's absolute pleasure and delight to chat on this Gupshup with my closest childhood friend from kindergarten, if I'm not mistaken, class prep. Thanks also to all the participants for joining. It's great to see so many old childhood friends. On today, it's the turnout is quite amazing. So I'm looking forward, and it's a real pleasure and delight to see all of you. And Gayatri, thanks for organizing. Looking forward to an interesting conversation over the next hour.
Thank you, Prachi. So those of you who are wondering, let me tell you that Prachi and I both attended St. Joseph's Convent High School in Patna from 1980 to 1991. And thereafter, we did our +2 from Notre Dame Academy, Patna. And it's absolutely, it's everything coming together to have Prachi on my Gupshup on Friendship Day. My oldest and closest school friends is really gratifying in many ways. Anyway. So, Prachi, you're again on mute. You want to unmute yourself now?
Yeah. Sure, I've unmuted.
Yeah. So, Prachi, you're a gold medalist from the Delhi School of Economics. And since this is the season of records, let me inform my audience that Prachi, while she was at D school, also set a new record there. She followed her D school Masters in Economics with a PhD from Columbia University in New York, where the title of her thesis was Essays on Globalization and Wages in Developing Country. Tell me, Prachi, while you were growing up, did you ever dream of becoming an economist?
The answer is no, Gayatri. I never dreamt of becoming an economist. I grew up in a family of doctors and lawyers. So I think the first, if I remember correctly, my first goal was to become a doctor because I was brainwashed to do so. Then I thought of becoming an engineer. And when I did not go into either of those professions, my parents were super happy, as all Bihari parents are, that I would ultimately become a civil servant.
Yeah.
So, but then I went to Delhi University. I was in Indraprasth College for my undergrad. I started liking economics, and then I went on to the Delhi School of Economics, where I think the intellectual environment and the faculty offered me, to further delve deep into the subject. And then, during my PhD, the interest and enthusiasm in economics further deepened. So, long story short, the answer is no. I never dreamt of becoming an economist, but that's where I am, and that's what life is.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to tell the audience, that Prachi comes from one of Bihar's most illustrious families. Her grandfather was retired Chief Justice of the Patna High Court, Justice S.C. Mishra. Her aunt Gyan Mishra, Justice Gyan Mishra, was Judge of the Supreme Court of India. Her mother is one of the leading gynecologists of Patna, Dr. Manju Geeta Mishra. Her brother, sister, father, they're all doctors. So it must have been quite a task for you to have said, no, you're not letting it on. But it must not have been an easy decision for anyone to have said no to law, to medicine, and of course, to no to becoming a civil servant. Like a good Bihari, you had to. Did you ever contemplate? Did you
So
ever?
I am a civil servant now. At the IMF, I'm an economist / civil servant. I'm an international civil servant, and I did come and serve the Government of India. I served the Reserve Bank of India. I was in the former PM's Economic Advisory Council. So hopefully, I think my parents, my father is no more, but my mother has experienced some of my serving, the Indian bureaucracy, and now I'm a part of an international bureaucracy, which is equally, I would say equally bureaucratic as the Indian government is.
तो आपने बिहारी होने का कर्ज चुका दिया. You are an international civil servant. Now that's out of the way.
मैंने और ऊपर मैंने हिंदुस्तान से बाहर जाके civil service की. So I think.
Yeah. So to all the young people listening in, do not limit your ambitions and do not limit your goals to only becoming a Sarkari Afsar in India. The world is your platter. Okay. So Prachi, we are very delighted that you embrace the field of economics with so much gusto, because now we are going to ask you some important questions regarding the Indian economy. It's very difficult to get an expert to answer questions about the state of the Indian economy. So tell me, the IMF recently lowered the growth rate projections for India from 12.5%, which they had estimated in April, to 9.5%. So while I know that you're not representing the IMF here, and this is a personal conversation, what was the reason behind this lowering of growth rate?
Gayatri, this is an excellent and very relevant question. I have to say that, I have to give the disclaimer, as I always do, that the views I'll express today on economics questions will be personal, as will be on non-economics questions as well, and definitely not related to the views of the IMF, its management, or its board. So look, I think, like most countries in the world, India was impacted severely from the COVID crisis. If you look at 2020, the second quarter, which was April to June last year, India experienced a 24% contraction in year-on-year terms. It's almost highest across the world. So definitely, I think the hit was very, very big in the first wave. We'll come to the second wave and talk about it. That said, the recovery was very strong thereafter. So if FY22, as you said, most growth forecast, FY22 is the fiscal year from April 2021 to March 2022. Most growth forecast would be around 8 to 9%. And people get very excited about these positive numbers, even though there is a lowering of growth forecast, and the lowering of the growth forecast is explained by the catastrophic second wave which India experienced. But the number is still, positive 8 to 9%, and people get super excited that look, India is the fastest growing economy, growing at 8 to 9%, etc. I think it's important to look at levels, and so you had a deep contraction in FY21, which is a fiscal year from April 2022 to March 2021, and then you have a strong recovery. Even though the recovery has been downgraded, as you mentioned, because of the second wave, still it's a very strong recovery. The point I would like to emphasize is it's important to look at levels of income and levels of output, especially during crisis times. So in the medium term, basically, you're talking about a level of economic output or GDP, which is 10 to 15% below pre-COVID trends. Had COVID not happened, how you would have grown, and now post-COVID, how you're growing. For most advanced economies like the US or Europe, etc., you are back to pre-COVID levels by end of next year, the latest. For emerging economies, including India, you're basically talking about a 10 to 15% output below pre-COVID trends. So basically, you've lost, it was a huge amount of output which you've lost, which is not hard to recover. So it's easy to get, either too depressed or too excited about these growth rate numbers. You have to look at this issue in terms of levels. So India's GDP is approximately, I think, $3 trillion US. If you look at, 15%, close to $500 billion of output or income has been lost. And that's probably a permanent loss to output. So if you look at, for example, the impact on poverty, I think 2020 and 21, I think close to 30 million Indians will enter extreme poverty. So the numbers highlight, I think, how urgent the situation is in terms of need to strengthen social safety nets, increase fiscal support, etc. And of course, we can talk more about it. And beyond all this economic impact, think about the impact on learning outcomes. Think about children who've not gone to school. How many people have actually been accessing online school? And think about the quality of people even in big cities. Quality of schooling when you're doing things online. So I think this is totally unprecedented. I think the shock is unprecedented. The recovery is unprecedented too, and everyone, all countries are learning as they progress. So let me stop here, and happy to hear.
No. I mean, so that's at one end. So I'd like to just tell our viewers. So, but what you're trying to say is, even with this 9%, 9.5%, 10% growth, in effect, it's only 1.5% to 2% over the previous level, because we had fallen down minus 24%.
Exactly.
So we are just now trying to get back to where we were, and that's also taking much longer.
Right. Exactly. So we are not getting back to where we were in the next. There is a loss, as I said, 10 to 15% output, which we are, losing, which is huge.
So the stated goal of a $5 trillion economy by 2024-25, that seems fairly distant right now. Is that a safe assumption to make?
So I haven't, done those calculations and how and when 5 trillion will be achieved. What I can tell you is that pre-COVID, you were $3 trillion economy. By 2024, you're going to lose about $500 billion. So even by 2024, you're not going to be back at. See, every economy is growing. So absent COVID, where would you be? And post-COVID, where you are, there is a gap of about $500 billion, which is huge.
Since you're also an expert on, in many ways, on the global economy, which are the other countries apart from India, which are also experiencing this kind of a contraction?
Look, I think all the countries in the world experienced contraction with COVID. The thing is, the recovery is very lopsided, and lopsided in the sense, global growth is projected to grow at about 6% in 2021. But there's a lot of difference between how advanced economies grow and the emerging economies grow. So advanced economies actually have been, their growth forecasts have been revised upwards, whereas emerging economies, their forecasts have been revised downwards. And the reason for that, one of the main reason for that is basically the difference in vaccination rates. So if you look, I think, if I'm not mistaken on the numbers, I think we are expecting about, close to 50% of, or close to 40%, I should say, in advanced economies has already been fully vaccinated, compared to 11% in emerging economies. And a much tinier fraction, if you look at low-income economies like Africa, it's even a tinier fraction. So one of the, so it's a very two-track pandemic in terms of the recovery. And the two-track pandemic is actually, it has implications for the two-track recovery as well. So bottom line, I think global growth is projected at 6% in 2021. But remember that this is very lopsided, and it's heavily skewed towards advanced economies. Advanced economies are contributing a greater portion of global growth than emerging economies.
But listening to our chief economic advisor, Krishnamurthy Subramaniam, he appears to be very hopeful. He says India has had a V-shaped recovery, and the last two consecutive quarters, we've had some kind of a growth that's only picking up. Somehow, one looks at that picture and feels everything is hunky-dory, but obviously it's not. He says that the impact of the second wave on the Indian economy has been less than that of the first. And the impact of the third wave is not going to be very deep.
So Gayatri, this is true across the world. The impact of the second wave is lower than the first wave. There are two reasons. If you think about restrictions, the lockdown restrictions are lower than what they were in the first wave. It's way more diffuse. You have more localized restrictions, etc. And the sensitivity of GDP or economic output to restrictions is also going to be less. And why is that going to be less? Because we learn to live with the virus, right? We learn, our habits change. There are different fancy online stuff coming in. So due to these two reasons, the fact that restrictions are going to be lower, and the sensitivity of GDP or economic output to restrictions is also going to be lower, the impact of the second wave is going to be lower than the first wave. So I think that is true across the world and not unique to India. I think, again, we have to keep in mind that, had COVID not happened, where would the country have been? And that's true of any economy in the world. And post-COVID, where we are going to be. Think of a trend, we were growing like this, and we are growing, post-COVID, are we going to grow like this? Or in some point, the trend should catch up to the pre-COVID trend. And that is not very clear for most emerging economies, including India. That's not happening, by 2024, 25. So I think that's the big picture to look in mind. I think it's absolutely correct. It's a V-shaped recovery. Again, there's very strong contraction once the virus hit, and then there's followed by a strong recovery. But where, once your growth rate hit after 24% contraction, you're hitting a level, where can you go, from there? You'll only go northward from there, right? So I think that's the message I would like to convey, that, we are talking about deep income losses, particularly for emerging and developing economies, including India, which is not being, you're not coming back to a pre-crisis trend by 2024, 25, which I think, and that's, as I said, the vaccination rates is one of the reasons. The other reason is also, emerging economies have limited policy space. Like, US can go and pump, 10% of GDP, 15% of GDP in terms of fiscal support. Most emerging economies, because they have constrained fiscal space, it's not that easy to do that kind of policy support. So divergence in the recovery paths is driven by divergence in vaccination rates and divergence in the policy support which these countries have actually given.
So we've had the former Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh saying that the current economic situation in India is probably graver than it was 30 years ago in 1991. You think it's because on the back of these reasons? Is it as grave? Are we worse off today economically than we were 30 years ago?
Look, I think it was different, I would say. So 1991 was a standard balance of payments crisis for India. So if let me give you a little bit of background. 89 to 91, I think, were marked by a lot of difficulties for India, both on economic and political fronts. I think when the new government took over in 1991, India was facing an external balance of payments crisis. If you remember, Gayatri, we were in school. I think it was, foreign currency assets of less than $1 billion. Now India has like $300 billion of foreign exchange reserves. That time it was just enough to cover 2 weeks of imports. Yeah. And then Government of India had requested a standby arrangement from the IMF in August 1991, and it entered into an IMF supported program. And then there were a host of policies, wide arrays of policies, that were introduced. It spanned external sector, trade, industrial, public sector, financial, banking, so a lot of liberalization across, all the fronts. 2020 is different, right? It is a pandemic crisis. It is totally unprecedented. It has affected human lives. And on top of it, it has affected livelihoods. And what is unique about this crisis is that the response to the crisis itself, what is the response to this pandemic crisis, right? You're locking down, etc. You're putting, that itself is screwing up the economy. So I think, I don't think, 1991 is perhaps a fair comparison to, the pandemic crisis. This is unprecedented. That was a external balance of payments crisis for India. Well known in the literature how these things happen. You have unsustainable fiscal balances that lead to unsustainable current account imbalances, which lead to a crisis. You don't have enough foreign exchange reserves. It was something that the IMF had dealt with many other countries in the past. This, I think, this pandemic is totally unprecedented. I think across the world, and of course in India, and countries with a high proportion of poor population. I think it's even more challenging and limited policy space, as I said. So I would say that this time is truly different, is how I would put it.
That's good to know. That's one positive thing, that we are not as as bad as we were then. We've come some way, maybe not a very long way, but definitely. So coming to the reforms of 1991, you're both finishing a class 10. Things were so different then. Which are the sectors do you think that have benefited most from the reforms of 1991?
I think if you ask me overall, before we go into the sectors, I think trade reforms were more significant. I think the average tariff in manufacturing, Gayatri, declined from 117% in 1991 to about 39% in 2000. And in addition to tariffs, I think India also reduced non-tariff barriers, import coverage ratio, share of imports that are subject to all these, complicated non-tariff barriers, that declined sharply, I think from 82% to 17%. And it was, in fact, way more, the trade liberalization which India saw was way more drastic than some of the other countries in Latin America, such as Mexico, Colombia, Brazil. So perhaps I think the 1991 trade reform in India represented one of the most dramatic trade liberalizations ever implemented in a developing country. If you ask me which sectors benefited the most, of course, I think manufacturing benefited the most, and including sectors like textiles, gems and jewelry, But of course, since 1991, there's been a lot of transformation. I think, of course, India's become much more open. Exports to GDP in India now at about, close to 20%, despite the slowdown which has happened over the last, I would say, last several years, even pre-pandemic. But 20% of exports to GDP ratio is as big as Indonesia. It's pretty high for a large country like India. And very interestingly, on exports, I think India's exports have also undergone a very quiet revolution. So there has been, we have friends who own, pharmaceutical companies and do the export business. They know that, so when liberalization happened, I think it was more about, textile, gems and jewelry, leather, etc. And over the last 2 decades, two kinds of transformations have happened. One is on the merchandise exports. I think there's been a move to new age exports, like engineering goods, electronic and pharmaceuticals. And I think that the second biggest transformation is from export of merchandise goods to services. So I think to put everything together, which sectors benefited most? I think it was manufacturing, but that has changed, over the last 2 decades. And so number one, I think trade reforms, if you ask me, were big. Manufacturing initially, but that has undergone transformation in the kind of manufacturing, and also the move from manufacturing to services.
Yeah. For me personally, I'll say the biggest, what I got out of the 1991 reforms were, the opening of the skies, cable television. What we are seeing now, I think this digital technology, we can trace back to, from the days of Doordarshan, the channels coming in. I think that was a big thing. And,
and the trunk calls, right? The telecom.
Telecom. I was
trunk calls, I think.
Not waiting in the line to make a call and not waiting in the line to get a telephone connection. You mentioned Latin America also. There's also research to show that actually in the last 30 years, income and wealth inequality in India has increased. And in some cases, it's even much more it's higher than the Latin American countries. Is that worrying? What is the impact of that on economic growth?
I think, if you ask me, I think the rise in inequality is definitely worrying. If the economy has definitely grown, right? You have early 2000s, for example, you had 7 to 8% growth, even touching, I think, close to 9%. It slowed down, but still you're growing at 5 to 6%, and the economy has grown. The size of the pie has increased a lot. And I have to say, pre-pandemic, India did make huge strides towards reducing the number of people in poverty.
Poverty, 300 million.
So poverty is still, you're talking about not the difference between the top and the bottom. You're talking about basically the bottom where they are. The fact that the difference between the top and the bottom percentiles of the distribution has gone up is, of course, I think, worrying. And it's related to a number of things, right? I think labor force participation rate, for example, of women has come down dramatically in India, right? I think there's research done on those, and I think there are different explanations that, is it related to the fact that it's harder, wages are increasing, right? It's more costly for women to go to work because they don't have alternative forms of childcare, etc. So to answer your question, I think definitely, so India did make a progress. It did make progress in lifting people, a large number of people out of poverty. If you look at the difference between the distribution of the top and the bottom, I think that has gone up, which is worrying. I think post-pandemic, this issue is going to become even more challenging, right? In terms of human capital, in terms of in terms of if the last time I think I looked at data on on, for example, unemployment rates, etc. I think
Absolutely.
the lower end of the distribution has been affected. So post-pandemic, this issue is going to become even more challenging.
In one way, it could even lead to more law and order issues, strife, civil strife in society.
Right. There's a literature which shows how, increase in unemployment is associated with higher crime. So I think that's, I think this is a challenge not only for India, but I think across the world, and especially for developing economies which have high fraction of poor population.
I'm digressing here a bit from the serious economic questions, and you mentioned about female participation in the labor force in India, how it's been going down, and thank God you have not been added to that statistics. Thank God you're carrying on so well, with balancing your professional and personal life. Have you ever faced challenges as a woman in your professional career?
I wouldn't like to say, that, it's because of gender issues, I may have missed out on opportunity. I don't think, I want to believe probably not, but I do not know the counterfactual. But overall, I think economics profession is very male oriented. I can give you some statistics. There is there are 2 males for every female PhD in economics, 3 males for every female assistant professor and associate professor, and 6 males for every female full professor. And there is plenty of research which suggests that there's a climate of discrimination in economics. For example, I remember looking at an American Economic Association survey. 69% of women felt, the 69% of the women who were surveyed actually felt that their work was not taken as seriously compared to, say, 43% of male respondents. Personally, I don't feel that, because I want to believe that I did not lose out on anything because of being a woman. But as I said, I don't know the counterfactual, and this issue is really big and, front running in the entire profession. It's not, so I have worked, in most, in fairly male dominated environment. I think the IMF now is turning, because, it's like the MD is, the managing director is actually a woman. And there is a conscious push, I think, to promoting women, etc. But I think in the profession more generally, this is a big issue. And I think many minds are thinking about, I think a lot of universities around the world, for example, have these affirmative action for women, etc. But it's, if there are no, if the supply is constrained, even if there's demand, it's not going to solve the problem.
Yeah.
So I think it goes, it's more deep rooted than we would think.
So when you're mentioning about the MD of your organization, you're talking of Geeta Gopinath.
No, actually, the MD of the IMF is a Bulgarian woman called Kristalina Georgieva.
Okay.
So, which is who succeeded Christine Lagarde, who's now the so for the last, I think, several years, IMF has had the privilege to be led by women. Geeta is actually the chief economist of the IMF.
And you work closely with Geeta?
Yes, I do work closely with Geeta. Actually, she's my boss, and I have worked with her on academic pieces for several years.
So we have people in the audience here who went to college with Geeta. Geeta is 5 years senior from me from LSR. So tell her that we said hi.
Okay.
The LSR community says hi. So that's good to know that you haven't really faced any kind of the obstacles or challenges, especially because of your gender. But unfortunately, that's not true for many people in different sectors. I'll tell you my example. As a journalist, starting or one of the biggest issues used to be lack of availability of a loo to be used.
Okay.
You're going, so you have to be ready. I mean, stuff like that, which doesn't really get counted. Does it get counted now in economic decision making, easy solutions? Maybe that's one aspect to look at.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is a huge practical issue, if you ask me, Gayatri. And I think it's sad we are still struggling with issues.
Yeah. Okay. So a side question to that. I mean, coming from Patna, were you in any case, did that hamper you in any way that, you've reached New York? And I remember you mentioning that once P. Chidambaram mentioned to you, how did you reach New York? How did you reach Columbia from Patna?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I think I grew up in a very I would say I came from a family where women were already working and were professional, so that definitely gave the motivation, I think, to do professionally, um, uh, you know, to professionally challenge myself to the extent I could. Um, but I think growing up in Patna, I think I was shy and I was diffident, and even now I think I'm shy. That's part of, I think, very different. I think if I compare my children who are growing up, in even in India, in Delhi, Bombay, outside India and Washington, I compare myself growing up in Patna, I was very diffident and shy. I think over a period of time, I tried to overcome that, but I think that inherent characteristic still remains. I think that's which I think is different for my children than it was for me.
But it served you well.
I actually, I would say so. I think it's, many times I feel, being shy and not being extra vocal is not that bad. It's you think through a number of times what you're saying, what you're going to say, which is I could just being upfront and probably I think so there has to be it's a delicate balance of being I shouldn't call it shyness, but I think there has to be a delicate balance of being upfront and vocal and trying to think through and pause for a minute. So I want to believe that it's that balance has to be developed over time. If you probably start as being too upfront and too vocal, you have to bring yourself down. If you start as being shy and diffident, you have to bring yourself up.
That's a valuable lesson there for all the youngsters listening in. How to make a mark in your career, how to move ahead, and more on that, Prachi. So, is that in some ways what is your life's motto? And who do you have someone who's inspired you? Do you have a role model? I know that you are a role model for many.
That's very kind of you, Gayatri, to say that. I think my life's motto is just carry on, live every single day. Keep on doing your work. Don't crave for stuff. I think if I crave for certain things, probably I don't get them. So whatever I get is fine. Whatever I don't get is also fine. I think it's so I try to live every single day and not think about what the big goals are and what my motto is, etc. I just every day I have to just live every day and live it to the best, cherish it and enjoy it. I think that's, if you ask me, that's my motto. In terms of my role model, I think my mother is clearly my role model. I think you mentioned my mother. I think my mother came from a very I think she had schooling. She went to school in a village, and my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, when she had to take her 10th board examination, she was younger by age, but she was, just because the older sister was coming to take the board examination to Patna, her father, just my maternal grandfather Nana, just brought her to Patna as well, and she cleared her 10th board examination, and then she joined Patna Science College without knowing English. And so she says that I used to read, but I never used to understand it. But so I read again and again and again, and that continued, with the fat books in medicine. When she went to Patna Medical College Hospital, and it was the same thing again. Very hard to even understand for somebody, because I don't think even medical books are actually written in Hindi. There's no. I don't think so.
Even
so
now, okay.
I doubt. I think that's my sense. So she said basically that she used to read again and again and again, and the second time she read, she understood by 10%. The third time she read, she understood 20%, and the fifth time and sixth time she read. So my mother is clearly a role model. I think she's set up a medical practice. I think I would say very much single-handedly, driven by and facing a lot of obstacles on a day-to-day basis. I think by now she would have treated, I don't know how many million patients, and she's highly regarded, and I think
rightly so.
Yeah, and I think just her, attitude in terms of how positive she is and how she keeps going on and fighting, I think is definitely she's my role model.
Yeah, there is a comment on it. I said from one of your on auntie. लगता है अब auntie को भी गपशप में बुलाना पड़ेगा अगली बार. But it's so good to know. Yes, absolutely. Your mother is your role model. I thought so also. Let's go back to economics. No, not many people. I mean, this is a new kind of profession, being an economist. It wasn't so. I mean, 30 years ago, one didn't hear of people wanting to become economists. And what is the role of so someone who's an undergrad or postgraduate student today? What is the role of an economist? What do you do essentially? What does the normal day for you look like?
So an economist, Gayatri, is a doctor for the economy.
Is a doctor for the economy. तो मतलब आप medicine कर मतलब आप doctor बन ही गई हैं. Doctor तो आप
I am a fake doctor. Once I was traveling in a train from Kolkata to Jamshedpur. There are no flights from Kolkata to Jamshedpur, so you have to take a train. I was going to XLRI actually, Shantanu's alma mater. And I remember I was sleeping in the train and, somebody woke me up. Doctor साहब, किसी को heart attack हो गया है. ऐसे हम वो वाले डॉक्टर नहीं है. And I put my my bed sheet back on my head and went back to sleep. But yeah, that's what it is. I think we are doctors for the economy, but we are not. We should not. We should not claim. I think medical doctors are way more important. I think they
and that we've seen in the pandemic how important doctors are.
Yeah. They deal with human lives and. So I think, but if you compare to an academic, for example, academics are more theoretical, or you must have heard about a two-handed economist, right? One on one hand and on the other hand.
Yeah.
We are if you're in policy and in the practical world, if you're a doctor of the economy, you have to take a view, and you have to take quick views, no matter with how much how little data you work, and that's true even if you're in the private sector, and if you're dealing with clients. You again need to take a view about what you think, what is the impact of the pandemic. You need to have numbers for those, why, what is the outlook for the economy, no matter how much, how little information you have, especially, consider, during times of pandemic, you don't know how the virus is going to evolve. You don't know how, the restrictions are going to evolve. You don't know how economic policies are going to evolve. You still need to have a view. I think, which is a bit different from on one hand, and on the other hand, while this is true, that is also true. So you have to come up with views, and very quick, especially during crisis times like this one, very quick views.
Okay, so then let me ask you a difficult question, since you're already saying how difficult it is. So, it's nearly 5 years since 8th November 2016, demonetization. So if you had to, what kind of an impact has demonetization had on the Indian economy? And do you think its stated objectives were met? Was it a rational economic decision 4.5 years after demonetization?
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer. I don't know the answer to that question. What I can say is I have done research. It's actually published research in a very respectable journal that looked at the impact of demonetization on the Indian economy. And there we try to look at the short-term economic impact, because that's easier to quantify and identify. There's a very sharp, there was a very sharp economic impact during the quarters of demonetization, and after that, in terms of reduced economic activity, lower demand for credit. I think if I want to give you some numbers, the effect is about 2 percentage point lower growth relative to a no demonetization counterfactual. That said, what we found is the effect was temporary, and we found that as cash was being replaced, you found the disappearance of these effects by about summer of 2017. And there were benefits as well, faster adoption of payments technology, higher deposit growth, and longer term benefits, which is hard to quantify even now. Improvements in tax collections or shifts in financial savings, behavioral changes. These are hard to quantify. So I very sharp, strong economic impact. it disappears by summer of 2017, and some benefits in terms of Paytm. I never knew how to use Paytm before demonetization.
And now mother also knows how to use Paytm.
Yeah, I know. And so again, this is a very complicated question in terms of what the longer term impacts are, and probably we need more data and more, data is still very lagged in India, so we need more data and more, more analysis to establish overall.
You mentioned that 2%, which is what Dr. Manmohan Singh had said then also, that it's like a shooting at the tires of a racing car, and it will lead to a contraction of about 2% GDP. But demon was followed by the introduction of the goods and services tax in 2017 with a lot of fanfare, and we still have a 5-rate structure. And just a few hours ago, the finance minister announced that the revenue GST collection for July 2021 has been 1.16 lakh crore. So, and I think that that's very encouraging. How do you view? I mean, again, it's just been 4 years, but any quick view on the GST?
Look, I think big reforms which have happened over the last, I would say, several years. I think 3 things. I think GST is number 1, bankruptcy code, and a new monetary policy framework. And GST, I think nobody will disagree that this was a big reform. I think where there have been issues is in the implementation. Implementing, something like GST in a large country, federation like India, is very, very challenging. And let me just tell you one, one complication which happened. How did we bring this? How did the central government bring the states on board to agree to GST? It was a grand bargain, as it is called. So basically, they guaranteed them a certain assured revenue growth, and the center was allowed to collect this compensation cess. We saw what happened during the crisis, right? Nobody, nobody foresaw what is going to come. So I think challenges in implementing a reform like this in a vast federation like India are really paramount. And in addition to that, you had the crisis, which magnified these effects. So I think in principle, this is definitely, this was, you talk to any economist, any tax expert, one of the big reforms, if you ask me, in addition to bankruptcy code and the new monetary policy framework. But of course, implementation has been challenging, and these challenges have been compounded by the pandemic crisis.
And the level of distrust between the central government and many state governments run by opposition, that's also not helping the case of GST.
Exactly. I think, the dynamic between the center and states is very, very, crucial, and in many, it's a bottleneck, and it's a big challenge.
Yeah. And coming to one of the smaller reforms, you were mentioning about the Niti Aayog vis-a-vis the Planning Commission. The Niti Aayog, is it fair to call it also some kind of, not a toothless tiger, but something without, the revenue has been taken out of Niti Aayog, and hence it's not as effective as one would like it to be? Or
I think the role of Niti Aayog as a main think tank is very, very important. Again, I think it's a new institution, so it will take some time to, and the allocation, to my understanding, the allocation of funds across states, that function has been that has gone to the Department of Expenditure. So in that sense, for Niti Aayog is even more challenging to make it more relevant, but it's the key think tank of the government, and it has
and it's been advising the government on GST also, among other things.
GST privatization. Privatization is a big thing. If you ask me, this is one of the big to-do things, right, of the moving forward. So I think Niti Aayog is playing a very key role in the private government's privatization agenda.
Okay, let's take an audience question. I mean, one of the audience members mailed a question earlier about the US dollar. Do you think the value of the US dollar diminishing in the coming 10, 20 years?
See, initially when the COVID crisis struck, the dollar appreciated on safe haven demand. This typically happens during the crisis. Investors flow into to the dollar because it's safe. But after that, actually, US dollar depreciated. Why did it depreciate? Because there was exceptional policy support in the advanced economies, particularly the United States. And that's why the US dollar depreciated. Going forward, I think fiscal and current account balances, maybe it's getting too technical, but they are going to be key drivers. And given that, we should see fiscal support as economies recover, advanced economies recover, US recovers, there's likely to be fiscal consolidation going forward. That should be associated with improvement in current account, which is likely to weaken the dollar further. So I think dollar depreciated. Initially, there was appreciation, but then, after a couple of months, there's strong dollar depreciation. I think one can, based on fundamental economic drivers, we should expect more depreciation going forward.
We should expect more depreciation. So which are the currencies which are likely to emerge stronger than in the coming decade?
Generally emerging markets, no? Because emerging markets is, and you can also think about, one is dollar depreciation, by definition is going to make the emerging market currencies stronger. But also that, so again, when the pandemic crisis struck, there was huge capital outflows from emerging markets. But then, as economies are recovering, you see capital flowing back to EMs, which is, which would appreciate the EM currencies as well.
So maybe Indonesia, Vietnam, Bangladesh.
Generally, I think emerging markets are treated as a basket. So I think I would say, EMs as a basket. And of course, there would be differentiation across the EMs depending on how the macroeconomic fundamentals are, how fiscal is, how current account is, etc.
There's another question. Prachi, what's your take on the hotel industry recovery in India?
I actually don't. Unfortunately, Gayatri, I don't have a sectoral view. I think whoever has asked.
A macro view.
I think the services sector generally across the world very challenging to recover. Right, manufacturing is recovering well. Services sector overall is lagging in the recovery. All contact intensive sectors, right? All contact intensive sectors, whether it's travel, transportation, hotels, it's going to be it's going to continue. If you look at high frequency indicators of economic activity, I think you mentioned that as well. If you look at manufacturing, I think the decline in manufacturing this time around after the second wave has been much milder than what happened in 2020. But the services is still fairly strong impact and a relatively strong recovery. Beyond that, I don't think I would have a specific insight into the hotel industry.
Okay, there's a question from Shweta. Would you like to comment on why billionaires all over the world became richer during COVID?
I think it's basically this whole online business and internet business. I think whoever went into areas like tech, right, tech sectors did well, and
the formal sector,
the formal and within formal, I think tech intensive sector, technology, for example, geofiber and all
digital payments.
Yeah, because everything is moving online, right? So whoever invested in these sectors, I think they did well.
I think that Shweta is referring to the news report which came in January of 2021, where was Mr. Mukesh Ambani was making 90 crores per hour. So that's what maybe. There's another question from Anshuman. Having worked for RBI as well as Government of India, where does Government of India lack? What does Government of India lack vis-a-vis RBI in terms of cutting edge research? Thank you. The question is from Anshuman. Would you like to take that?
It won't be appropriate for me to compare, one institution versus it's a big picture. I think whatever research is done in the RBI actually feeds in. A lot of it is public, and it feeds into more generally, I think, policy making. So I won't like to actually compare RBI, Ministry of Finance, etc. Central banks in general, I think across the world have research. Ministry of Finance, most I think wouldn't have a research department. Most countries.
I've lost you. Prachi, you've gone on mute.
I don't know how automatically.
Yeah. नहीं, ठीक है.
So I think
that's fine. Yeah. That's a nice diplomatic answer. Yes, good. We can see. Yeah. So, which brings us now that you mentioned the central bank, you worked with one of the most charismatic central bankers there's been, someone who was almost a sex symbol in India, the Ranbir Kapoor of banking. I'm obviously referring to Dr. Raghuram Rajan. Shobha Ray made out to compare him to Ranbir Kapoor. What was that experience of working with Dr. Rajan?
I think Dr. Rajan is one of the top financial economists globally. Extensive policy experience. He was the chief economist of the IMF too. So I think it was a unique opportunity to have worked with him, and that's
Can
what.
you tell us more than that? Something more.
And
Did he like this comparison?
I don't know, Gayatri. I think it's hard for me to comment on any of this, whether he liked the comparison or he did not. But what I can say is, look, I think he's very respected globally as an economist and as a policymaker, and it was fairly evident, I think, in having worked under him.
Okay. Audience, any more questions from you? Please send us in the chat box, or any comments that you want to make on this Gupshup. One more question, Prachi. Yeah. So you said that you take each day as it comes, but something that you want to achieve, you have your goals set on something, say 5-10 years down the line.
Gayatri, I think good health. This pandemic has taught us good health and happiness for myself and all my loved ones. Many of them are on this show, including yourself. So that's what I think. Good health and happiness and cherishing each day is what I want to achieve. Which is not a small feat.
Yeah,
I would say. I definitely want to read more. I want to have more time for reading. I think beyond what I'm able to do.
Whom are you enjoying these days? What are you reading these days?
I like reading autobiographies a lot. So I finished Michelle Obama recently.
Okay. You've got Kaushik Basu's new autobiography?
I haven't got, but I should, get my hands at Kaushik's.
I want to read the new one by Veer Sanghvi.
Okay.
Yeah, he's also written Rude Life. Yeah. Okay, there's an interesting question from Kriti. As a mom, do you think we should teach our kids financial literacy early on?
Absolutely, I think. It's just telling them, even if it's very hard to teach financial literacy to children. That's where the challenge comes. And as a teacher, if you can express these things, because in India, there's research done on that also, that how these insurance companies, etc., how there have been frauds. Published research, how there have been frauds, because there is these products are sold to financially illiterate people. And that has to be goes deep down, rather than you cannot teach somebody financial literacy at an older age. So I think the earlier you start, at least what simple financial products are, what's the basic math. I think it has to do with financial literacy, but generally more analytical training, I think, right from the beginning, so that people can think, children can think through. And I always felt as a part of our curriculum and our teaching, what we were taught, we were always told to accept what was being taught, rather than being questioning everything. And I think financial literacy is a part of that, right? Don't tell your children that there is a pros and there's a con, there are costs, there are benefits, and you have to you have to balance the two. I think so. Answer to Kriti's question is absolutely yes.
You want to take this question from Piyush Garg about cryptocurrencies?
I have to, I'll pass this question. I'm definitely not an expert on cryptocurrency, and I should probably spend more time on thinking about that. So I'm going to give it a pass.
Yes. Oh, I have one question from your better half. So for the audience, yes. Prachi's husband Devesh is also a senior economist, and he works in the area of food security. So Prachi, you and Devesh in many ways, exemplify. Many people would say maybe doing well in India and going studying overseas and staying on there in many ways, it could be called brain drain. And there was this whole negative, image associated with brain drain. What are your views on that? What you did was is that brain drain, or what does it mean for the economy?
See, brain drain, Gayatri, was a terminology, and there's huge literature on this. It's a very fairly old literature, 1970s and all. Professor Jagdish Bhagwati also contributed to this literature. It's highly educated people migrating. It's particularly
Skilled people and
yeah,
educated people.
right, and it's particularly more severe, more than India actually, because it's always measured as a population of people in your home country. So if you look at Caribbean countries, they have lost more than 70% of their labor force with more than 12 years of completed schooling. For smaller countries, it's a much bigger issue. But I think the positive part of that is, if you look at the Caribbean, it's also the world's largest recipient of remittances as a fraction of GDP. So I think countries could take two approaches, including India, take two approaches to migration. One is, try to minimize the losses and try to retain the high skill, which is not going to happen, right? We live in democracies, and which is not going to happen. I think the second approach, which is to seek to increase the benefits of immigration by what I would call a diaspora approach. Use the diaspora to build networks for trade, tourism, investment promotion, harness the knowledge, skills, assets, attract, higher and more efficient form of remittances. I think that's more relevant, I think, more generally to countries which face this problem, and in fact to India too. So I think we have to think a little bit differently from brain drain to brain gain and brain circulation.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's an outdated concept. There's so much more you can learn by, having the global exposure. And as you've come back and served, given, the benefit of your experience and your knowledge, just to take your example and Devesh's examples. There's a question from Dr. Sanjay Gala. Where do you see India from here, 10 years from now?
Look, I'm very, very positive about the economy over the medium to longer term. I think that the country has, I know there's been a lot of debate on population, etc. I think one of the big, advantage which the country has is, a young population. And if you look, if basically, your productivity is an increasing function of age. 40 to 49 are the most productive. I think half the additions to the Indian labor force over the next 20 or 10 years is going to be in the age group of 30 to 49. And if you look at other countries like China, Korea, US, that proportion will actually be declining. And the fact that India will be expanding its most productive cohorts, even while these developed countries and some developing countries will be contracting, is a huge advantage for India. But I think but the main challenge is that, will there be enough productive jobs? And productive jobs are going to be vital for growth. And a good job is the best form of inclusion too. We talked about inclusion, inequality, etc. And I think more than half of the population depends on agriculture. But the experience of the other countries suggests that number of people dependent on agriculture will have to shrink. Per capita incomes in agriculture are to go up substantially. And industry in India is creating jobs, but a lot of these jobs are low productivity jobs, contractual jobs in the unorganized sector. They offer little income, little protection, and no benefits. Services, on the other hand, are relatively high productivity, but employment growth in services has been very slow in recent years. So I think our challenge is to create the condition for faster growth of productive jobs outside of agriculture, especially in organized manufacturing and services, and even while improving the productivity in agriculture. And that's, I think, the benefits of rising to this kind of challenge will ensure a decade of strong inclusive growth. So broadly, bottom line, I think I am positive. But of course, there are medium-term challenges, and of course, pandemic is not going to make things easy.
And you mentioned about the fact that we have a young population. That's one of our USPs. But 25 years ago, we were taught that the population is one of our biggest challenges and one of our biggest worries. And even now, there's a lot of debate about how we need to control our population to grow. Are we at that point in time, or now the time is?
No, I think per capita income, the higher the population, basic economics suggests that per capita income is going to be lower. But I think young population is a big dividend for India. I think that, in my view, that dividend has to be harnessed, and that will happen. You have to seize that demographic dividend, and that's going to happen through rising up to the challenge of creating productive jobs for the young.
There's a question from another Mr. Bisheshwar Mishra. With inflation rising, taper talk, and oil on the boil, what's your outlook on employment and GDP in the short end?
Look, as we talked about it already, Gayatri, short end, we are seeing, if you look at GDP growth, it's going to be very sharp recovery, because that's where you're coming from a deep contraction. But it's going to be an uncharted recovery, a lot of uncertainties. I think inflation is one of the, we didn't talk much about inflation, but I think, there's big debate globally on, how inflation has been rising in emerging economies, but also in advanced economies. There's pent-up demand, there's supply chain bottlenecks, there's rising commodity prices, oil, gold, metals, etc. All of that is putting upward pressure on prices. And I think I would like to believe that a lot of these pressures are transitory and that they should go away. But we never know. I think, as I said, it's very uncharted. I think there are in-house prices, for example, in the US and many other economies are rising sharply. So I think, and particularly in emerging economies, inflation is expected to remain elevated. Food inflation is a big issue. I think if you look at countries like India, but also outside India, if you look at low-income countries in general, I think because food is such a high share of the consumption basket, that food inflation is also one of the top concerns. So bottom line, I think we are going to be in a recovery phase, but a recovery which is going to be quite lopsided and very uncharted.
Okay, yeah. We'll take the last question for the evening from Sumita Jha. This is a question which is addressed to working, never to men. What is the key to managing work-life balance? How to
absolutely. I think this is one of my biggest challenges. If you ask me, I have two teenage. The older one is a teenager. The younger one is soon to become a teenager. So that's the biggest challenge. I think I'm an Iyengar yogi for the last. I think I started for the last 5 years. I feel I'm still a beginner. I think that's what helps me maintain my sanity and maintain a good work-life balance. If you ask me one thing, I think
that's what you do to de-stress. Iyengar yoga.
I clearly do that to de-stress. I think, but I'm learning. I think I can do certain poses, but I think it's been hugely beneficial in terms of not only how I feel physically, but how I feel mentally as well, and how I can deal with day-to-day stresses, including raising close to two teenage girls.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this Gupshup, Prachi. You were at your diplomatic best and charming as ever. I know you were being modest when you say you've just started doing Iyengar yoga, because you also do the Shirshasana.
Yeah, I do. I've actually started now in the middle of the room, but I feel I still need to, there's a lift which has to come, which is not there. I think it's, I can do it, but I think I still need to progress a lot in Shirshasana.
Yeah. So just carry on as your life's motto. Just carry on, live every day as you're doing right now. You're doing a fabulous job with the girls. I'll say that. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, dear audience, for joining in today for this very special episode of Gupshup with Gayatri on Friendship Day with my oldest and closest school friend. So till the next episode of Gupshup with Gayatri, Old World Conversations with New Age Technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gayatri. It's been absolute pleasure and delight. And thanks to the audience for all the great questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.